Okay, if you've watched the first lecture in the Formal Report lecture series, that first lecture is on the different types of reports that are written in the business world. Then you know that you may wind up writing proposals, you may wind up writing recommendation reports, feasibility studies. There are a whole bunch of different types of reports that you may wind up writing, and what's going to change, what may vary, is the format that you're going to write them in. You can write these reports as informal reports, or you can write them as formal reports. You may actually wind up writing these more as informal reports than you will as formal reports. Now, informal reports actually follow the format of the proposals that you're writing this week, or that you're turning in this week, except for the fact that because you tend to do these more within your company, you're probably going to, in general, write them as memos. Now, I say in general because there is no hard and fast rule, and even within your company, you may occasionally wind up writing informal reports in letters. You may also occasionally wind up writing these to people outside of your company if they prefer something shorter. Now, these are usually reserved for more minor reports. That does not mean that you get to ignore grammar. It doesn't mean that you get to ignore sentence structure. It doesn't mean that you can do an inferior job where you don't pay attention to the details. Just because it's staying within your company doesn't mean that everything doesn't count, because this is still your representative. It's still an example of the quality of the work that you will be doing. So just as the proposal was basically your resume, this is still your resume as well. You're sending this on as your representative, and this says something about the quality of the work you're going to do. So it still needs to be pristine, even though it's short, even though it's staying within your company, even though it's going to be more informal. You still need to pay attention to detail. It's probably going to be used for one-time reports, something where people read it once and then the information is filed away, or the information is used for some other purpose. It's not going to be the kind of thing where they come back to it over and over and over again, or the information gets a lot of heavy use. So that may mean that it is paper clipped, or it is stapled together. The information may not be as seriously investigated, or the situation may not be as seriously investigated as some other situations. But attention to detail in your research and attention to detail in your reporting and your writing is still very important, because this is still your representative. Now, because these do stay within your organization, memo format is acceptable, as is an informal tone. And by informal tone, I mean contractions. I mean possibly using first person I. That's what I mean by informal tone. Not slang, not cliches, not less than professional language. These also tend to be no more than 10 to 15 pages long, and I know that 10 to 15 pages long still seems long, but not whenever you look at other things in the business world. Okay, formal reports are going to be different in every other way from an informal report. They may still use the same topic. They may still be the same kind of report. You may still be writing a personnel report or a feasibility study, but the moment you switch into formal report format, everything changes, because the chances are that your audience is going to change. The chances are that the situation is going to change. The length changes. Formal reports tend to be 15 to 20 pages long, 15 to 25 pages long. An informal report caps out at about 15 pages long. A formal report starts at 15 to 20 pages. I have actually seen formal reports go all the way up to 200 to 500 pages long. I've seen some formal reports that were multiple volumes, and then you had a volume that was nothing but an index volume telling you where you found information in the other 9 volumes. So they can become very, very long. The structure becomes very complex, so that you will have tables of contents, you'll have a list of illustrations, you'll have abstracts, you'll have an introduction, you'll have a list of references, you might have an index, you might have a glossary. It all becomes very complex, and your language becomes elevated the moment you step into that formal report format, just because the situation and the audience may change. Because the audience changes, you have to change the language, you have to change everything else. You may be sending this to somebody outside of your organization. It may be going to a client, it may be going to shareholders, it may be going to investors, but it may also be going to the president or vice president of the company. It may be going to your supervisor. The situation may be different. It may be that your supervisor has specially requested that you look into a certain very problematic situation. And if that has happened because of the situation you're investigating, because of the fact that you were specifically requested to investigate this situation, it warrants formal report format just because it's a very tricky situation that you're investigating. Because of that, you are always going to assume a more formal tone. You're writing to people outside of your organization. You might be writing to people higher up in your organization. These audiences always receive letters instead of memos. They receive formal reports instead of informal reports. It just presents you and your company in a better light, in a more professional light. And for that reason, you go with the more formal format, so that you present yourself better to that potential client, that potential investor. Another reason that you might use them is if the information in that document is going to receive extended use. Employee handbooks are usually done in informal format, just because they get used over and over and over again. An informal report that is going to probably just be stapled together is not going to stand up to heavy use, is not going to stand up to repeated readings where somebody is flipping through pages looking for information. A formal report will, just because of the fact that it is bound together, and you actually have what amounts to a spiral binding, so that readers can flip through pages. They can go to a table of contents and look for information that they need. That will hold together much better than an informal report will. You won't have to worry about people losing pages, about people losing information, about pages becoming lost or separated. So you also there have to think about how the information is going to be used, and if it's going to be used over a long period of time. That's also something to think about when you're trying to decide what format to use for a particular type of report. Okay, informal reports have a very simple format, and you need to keep this in mind when you're actually developing that. Because they're going to be set up as memos, you're going to need to make sure that you have that clear memo heading. that date to from subject, and that your subject line has that very clear listing of what the topic is. Then you're going to move into a memo body where you have the introduction. The introduction in a formal report actually introduces the topic and the background. You need to talk about why you're writing this report. What problem or what situation led up to it? What are you investigating? Is this a trip report? Is this a recommendation report? What problem are you trying to recommend a solution to? That goes into the introduction. And then in the rest of it, you go through and actually discuss your recommendations. So in the body of it, in the discussion section, what information do you actually need to fulfill your stated purpose? Is it a recommendation report? If so, then you run through in that body the discussion of your solutions and then make the recommendation for what you think is the correct solution. And then in your conclusion, you wrap everything up. You need to make sure in your conclusion that you tell them what your actual recommendation is. What information have you reported? You need to, particularly in a conclusion, make sure that you give contact information. Who do they go to if they need to ask questions? Can they come to you if they need to ask questions? What information do they need as far as how to get in touch with somebody? If you're willing to answer their questions, you always need to make sure that you tell them, if I can be of any assistance, please don't hesitate to call me at. Always make sure that you give them your information, because that's what actually lets them know that you're actually open to answering questions. If you tell them, if you tell them that I'm always willing to answer questions, but then you don't actually give them your information, then how open do you really seem to answering their questions? Not really very open.